This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Rick Lowe. Renowned for his pioneering work with Project Row Houses in Houston, Lowe's creative endeavors have reshaped the landscape of contemporary art and in 2014 earned him a MacArthur Fellowship. In our conversation, we explore the concept of social sculpture and its ability to transcend traditional art boundaries to catalyze societal transformation. We also explore Lowe's personal evolution, including his celebrated return to painting in his current exhibit in Venice. And now, a conversation about the complexities of creativity and activism with the visionary artist Rick Lowe. Rick Lowe, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Rick, I wanted to talk to you because you have an exhibition coming up in Venice in conjunction with Gagosian called Rick Lowe, The Arch Within the Arc at the Museo del Palazzo Grimani, April 17th to November 24th. Rick, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, let's say you're sitting at a dinner party next to someone who has no idea who you are or what your work consists of. Where do you begin to explain to them what that is?
Boy, that's a mouthful to start with. But thank you for having me here. This is great. Generally I just try to, I start by giving an overview. Just letting folks know that I was trained as a painter, and I did paintings throughout the 80s and into the 90s. And then I made this kind of pivot away from making objects to what I like to call social sculpture, because I was kind of guided that way and framed conceptually the work that I was doing based on my readings of Joseph Beuys. And so that was two phases of my career. And then I found myself back painting again. But the interesting thing about the painting part was that in the 80s and early 90s, the paintings were very, they were kind of anti-aesthetic, very much so about didactic politics and very aggressive in that way. And then this time, nearly 30 years later, going back to painting, it's much more subtle, right. And abstract, and I think it really, both of those approaches kind of says a lot about who I am and where I was and where I am now, and my kind of energy and my motivation for work right now. So that's the overview.
Is it impolite for me to say, and I feel like I hear other people say this too, is that I was surprised to see what your paintings look like now. I didn't anticipate the aesthetic, the size, the scope, the quality. I mean, I don't mean for it to be a backhanded compliment, but your paintings that you're producing now are astounding. It's not something that I would have ever anticipated, but I can see that, all of the work that you've done over the past 30, 40 years is embedded in that.
Yeah. Well, I was surprised too, though. I would join you in that. If my if someone had asked my 30-year-old self, had showed them these paintings and said, do you think those were Rick Lowe paintings, whatever, I was like, no, I don't know. I think I would have liked them, but I would have been like, that's not in me. Basically because my I didn't come into art at a very early age. I came into art in school, in college, and and I never had that kind of childlike element of art that people, when they start early, they can retain some of that, that kind of fluidity of making things, the imagination of things and abstractions of things and that kind of stuff. I didn't have that. So when I started painting with, very rigid kinds of frameworks, of when I was painting landscapes, I was either painting them from photographs taken or we were painting, real life from, a real trying to render something that was already there. And and so that's kind of got it. My sense of, creative practice with painting was always to, I never thought of myself as being, someone that could be an abstract thinker. And so it would have surprised me. And so I'm still pretty amazed at how I managed to stumble into this kind of way of working that seems to fit so naturally. It just organically happened.
About a year and a half ago, I had a conversation with Jerry Saltz, and Jerry was a painter in Chicago. Now, looking back, he says, I just wasn't that great. And next thing you know, he winds up driving trucks. And next thing you know, he's winning a Pulitzer for being, in art criticism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, the conversation with him is like, well, if you were a painter and that was your full-time gig, like, is that itch not still there? Like, I mean, are you sure you don't, in the back of your mind, want to pick up a brush and get back into it? And I think he thinks of his criticism practice as being his art now. But what brought you back? I mean, is it just the fact that in the middle of your social sculpture, your social practice, a big part of the community in Project Row Houses is about opportunities for art making? And did that just kind of bring you back in? Like, where did it come from?
No, I think Jerry's right in a sense that, it's kind of almost like, if you're trained as a lawyer, you may not practice law, but you're still trained as a lawyer. You still think like, your training has taught you, or if you train, however. So, being trained and spending, 10 years or so painting, I stopped actually doing the physical paintings, but in my head, I saw the world always as paintings. I mean, I remember when I was in Documenta in 2017, when I was invited by curator Monica. We were walking through Athens, and where I started this project, Victoria Square project, and she was kind of watching me because was using my iPhone and just capturing these detailed images of things that were interesting to me. And she would look at them, she goes, "You're such a painter." I mean, this is before she knew I was, actually heading that direction. But because it's just a way, there's a sensibility. That's a way that you kind of see the world, the way that you think, the way that, yeah. And the way you talk about things too. It becomes a part of you.
Now, that reminds me, earlier this week, I had a conversation with an author who's just released a book called Why Surrealism Matters. I hadn't really done a deep dive on surrealism. I always thought, melting clocks and bowler hats. But one of the things that the surrealists did was they were always looking around them for the marvelous and the miraculous in the everyday. And this whole concept of walking down the street and looking closely at a pavestone is very much in line with kind of the surrealism philosophy.
Yeah, I mean and I think in those kinds of things, even if someone decided they were going to stop painting and making surrealist paintings, they don't stop seeing the world that way. Somehow they continue to see the world through that lens.
And it was also interesting to have had that conversation this week leading up to a conversation with you, because a lot of what the surrealists were doing was regards to a kind of a social philosophy in this trying to imagine the unimaginable.
Hmm.
And part of the conversation is about how surrealism as a thought process and a philosophy kind of influenced like the Haitian Revolution. This whole concept of getting people to think, for a revolution to happen, for change to happen, for social change to happen, you have to get people to think that bigger and better is a possibility.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I've always said that, that's one of the powers of art, and I use that particularly in the context of my, social practice work was, to be able to, kind of stoke people's imagination. You give them something that they can start to build on in an imaginative way. And that's kind of how change happens. You have to be able to imagine it on some level.
So, what is the recipe for? Maybe it's a loaded question, but what's the recipe for successful social practice, successful social sculpture?
Yeah. Well, so for me, I mean, there are many, many different ways to answer that question, but I just go to the basic ones that influenced me. And it was, the idea of Joseph Beuys kind of talking about this sculptural form that we can shape, the real world that we're in. That's the core of it. But the part that got me the most was that when he said everybody is an artist. And then it was kind of like, to me, that became my kind of the thing that I aspired to the most in all the work that I did, was trying to figure out, how can I frame work within this project that empowers people to become agents in their own, in the change that they seek in their own lives, their own community, or whatever. So to me, whenever the projects are, there's a sense of ownership by folks that are in it. That's when it works. And I really think, the in a sense, that whole idea is something that is, I think what Beuys was doing was tying art as a fuel to uh, uh, maintaining, sustaining, and growing democracy. Because we can kind of, just even trying to get people to imagine themselves as creative agents in their communities, in the world, is, I mean, that's a lot to ask, especially when you have a situation where in our democracy here in America, it's hard to even get people to, participate and be agents in their own, in the electoral process, which is not asking a lot. It's not asking you to go out and do a whole lot. It's just go plug in a vote.
No, I mean, in your answer there, it's obvious that buy-in and ownership is integral. And it reminds me, I had a manager one time give me some great advice on trying to manage an employee in deadlines. And his tip was, instead of telling your employee, I need this report and I need it by this date, say, I need this report. When do you think you can have this to me?
Yep.
And at that point, the employee can't say, well, that deadline's not reasonable.
Yeah.
The employee's given himself, he's the one who created that deadline. And so when you start asking people, well, what is your idea? And if their idea is included, now they're going to work harder because they feel like they have ownership over what that is or was, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That, to me, that's the end product of the work, is helping people see their potential to be agents, to imagine things and to work toward things in their lives, in their communities that they value or that they desire, and and you don't, I mean, one of the big things I think that's happening now, it, from a social change perspective, a social justice perspective, is that we're shifting the energy and the possibilities of change from kind of grassroots, from pressuring governments to allowing the billionaires to set the agenda for what should be, and how to address certain changes.
How's the best way to navigate that? I mean, there's long been, a divide on what role should we expect government to play in helping people with a leg up. How do we mobilize change at a grassroots level? I mean, is it lobbying? Is it finding philanthropy within a community? Is it doing good work and then hoping that the right people see the good work and come alongside you and help, lift you even higher? What is it?
Yeah. I think it's a mixture of a lot of things, but education is like, at the core, and it seems like we've given up on education, on people really, utilizing education to give them agency to do things that they believe in or that they understand. We don't understand the world any longer the way that we're educated, and best people are educated to become, widgets in the cogs in the wheel, but not to be, free thinkers, and to know how to build things. And, I always go, there was a great book. I think it's 1931. The writer, educator, Carter G. Woodson, an African-American writer, wrote this book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And it was a fascinating book, that kind of highlighted the fact that, you had a group of people that were freed from slavery, and, and they had the grit to figure out how to survive and how to sustain. And they became very entrepreneurial and all of this stuff, and knowing the world that they lived in. And then they slowly got institutionalized into the education system, which then we lost all of that, and then we became mainly just educated to be cogs in the wheel, as opposed to free thinkers and thinkers about how the world fits for us. And I think that's just kind of spread throughout now, and it's a tough challenge. So we don't have the capacity to kind of really leverage government in the way that we used to.
That makes me think of, maybe this is an interesting segue into your painting practice, because it makes me think of your painting Black Wall Street. And, there was a unique entrepreneurial spirit there in Tulsa, and that wasn't a gentle oppression. That was something quite cataclysmic.
Yeah. And that became something that really kind of lit my fire around, the economic plight of people, in a very specific way, in terms of how the entrepreneurial approaches and the belief in entrepreneurialism to actually kind of give agency, to people in their communities, and to be able to kind of and also to also give power too, right? I mean, power comes with that kind of wealth, that comes along. And so, I wanted to, and I'm still working on this project, Black Wall Street Journey. I'm trying to understand it, what are the parameters around the American economy that has, that maintains African Americans in the position that they are, but it's not only African Americans either. I mean, it's but I mean, African Americans is a set group that we can kind of focus on, in a way. But poverty is throughout this country, so I'm very interested in looking at that and trying to figure out, though, for me, you know, and this is the way I've worked on my community engaged work as well, is that I I didn't know about community development when I started Project Row Houses. So the way that I tried to understand was to create conversations around it and bring people into the process that can help educate me and others around these issues. Similarly with Black Wall Street. I mean, Black Wall Street Journey is that I don't know what the answers are. I don't have the answers. I mean, I'm constantly, this project has been kind of moving through different institutions, doing research and all, trying to get an understanding, and trying to access people that have, better frameworks to be able to articulate what's going on so that we can, really start to get some insight.
Well, you mentioned that the people groups expand beyond African American. It makes me think of immigrants. And 20 years ago, my wife and I volunteered with IRC and were given a refugee family to try to help mentor in the Vickery Meadows area of Dallas.
Yeah.
And so
I'm very familiar with that, that area.
I, of course, given my firsthand experience in that community, just an amazing melting pot, and it just felt like a community that was so different than the city that resided around it. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience was going into that community also, and what you saw there?
Yeah, that was a very interesting project for me, and I was very excited to do it because prior to that, most of my focus had been kind of around African American communities, and that's where I'm consider myself most comfortable and most connected in a sense. And so when the National Sculpture Center asked me if I would do a project with them for the 10th anniversary, I knew a couple people in Dallas, and I asked them, what should I be looking at? And someone told me about Vickery Meadow. It was a very interesting place, right? Because it's a vast area of apartments. I remember my first trip there. I just thought, what's interesting about this? Because it was nothing but just streets and streets and streets of apartment buildings, and kind of the 70s style that was, but kind of dated, they're dated because this is like, in the 2000s, and I'm like, So, but then somebody said, no. I called my friend and I said, what's important about this place? I don't see anything. They said, no. You have to go back around school time when school lets out. And I went back and I was like, oh boy, because you could see all the people out on the streets and all the kids and people going to pick up kids and folks from you see these tall, lanky, very dark people from parts of Africa. You see these people, very colorfully dressed people from, South Asia, and places all over. I mean, I was just going, oh my God, this is amazing. And, but I didn't know, I mean, I don't know anything about, refugees and immigrants. I didn't know anything about that, and so I just started poking around and trying to figure out what the issues were. And some of the issues that people had was that, it was such a dangerous place. Everybody was talking about the danger of Vickery Meadow, but I'm thinking to myself, oh, but this place is so diverse, man. How can it be so dangerous? It's like, that's what we like in America, right? So we say that we're for diversity. And so in my research, I've managed to go to a session that a group of church women were having. It was on a Wednesday. They call it Mom's Lunch, in which they would invite, maybe 4 or 5 women from 5 or 6 different countries together, and they would have lunch and they would share and would talk and all. And I was like, that sounds interesting. I wish I could go. But I knew, like, oh, that's a women's thing, you can't go. But then I thought, but I really need to go, And so I talked to one of the women from the church and I said, look, could you just let me sit in the back? I'll just sit quietly in the back. And I just want to, it was the most amazing experience I've ever seen, to see like these women that have traveled through horrific situations, some talking about, I have 5 children, 2 are still in Baton, and, 1 is somewhere else, and I have 2 with me, but I don't know where the other one, it's just, I was going, oh my God, heart-wrenching, right? And they were there supporting each other. And then they also had like this thing, though, the food, like a different one would make food and that kind of stuff. So it was a cultural thing too. And that was the thing that kind of got me interested in cross-cultural experiences. And so we moved toward that project of developing these developing a market, because the thing about Vickery Meadow was that there was nothing on the streets for people. And and I thought most of the people that were the immigrants there, they had come from places where things happen on the streets, and so we decided we would host markets, and most people didn't want to do it, but it was most of the museum people thought it was a crazy idea, like nobody's going to want to go to that. Some of the church people, they thought it was like, no, the people don't trust each other and all, so I've got a lot of negative stuff. But, the thing is, as artists, we try to imagine things, and the key thing though, is being an artist, that we have to do it. We have, when you make a painting, I mean, if you're a painter, you have to make that painting, even if it may be a shitty painting, but you have to make it, that's the point. And so I was like, well, everything's pointing toward this thing. And we did it, and it was amazing. The first one, way more people came than we, had thought, and participated by bringing food dishes from their culture, and then realizing how excited people were to share their cultures. And then the next one with talent shows, that was like the best, having people share their cultural talents. It's just great. So that was a great opportunity for me to kind of position myself in a place where there was a kinship of the experience of me being an African American with people from many different countries.
Hearing you speak about that, it just makes me think that what a big role architecture plays in providing opportunities for community, right? Like when you look at that 70s style apartment complex where, there isn't communal space, there aren't stoops, versus just having heard you talk about John Biggers and how he's able to describe what the original intention of the row houses were, with the stoops and the shared, space in the back. I mean, even when you think of some of these high-rise projects in urban areas like in Chicago and New York, and how you're confining people to a space, but they're still strangers to one another because you barely will know who lives on either side of you.
Yeah. And, architecture does that. And, and in many cases, politics benefit from it. Politics benefits from people not being in community with each other, and so with all those apartments, I think it was something like 50,000 units of apartments in Vickery Meadow at its height. And having 50,000 apartment units that has no, outside of each apartment unit maybe having communal pool or something, whatever. But no one, there wasn't not a community there. People had to leave their apartment complexes to go find their community. And and that's that's a kind of architecture that to me feels like it has political intention, of keeping people apart, and not encouraging that thing where people come together and they conspire.
Right.
So yeah.
Those words make me think of political mapping, gerrymandering, redlining, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see the connection between those sorts of terms and the images that you create these days. I mean, am I bringing my own baggage, or is that something that you intentionally are thinking as you're working through this new body of work?
Well, it's definitely implied, and it's intentional in the sense that I use these paintings in my time in my studio painting as a way of reflecting on the few things that I've learned over the years of engaging with people and being engaged in politics, and in the many, 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 many things I don't know, and there's much more I don't know, because it's always the thing, the more you know, the less you know, and I'm
Right.
kind of understanding that, the more I thought I knew, the less I knew. But let me just say though, it's and this going back to the early thing about my approach to painting earlier being more structured and around kind of representation and that kind of stuff. The way that the current paintings now with this mapping like quality, and sometimes kind of hieroglyphic-y lettering quality, it's not something that I mapped out and I was in pursuit of. It wasn't that way. It grew organically out of my process of being in community, and I'll tell you the story about how the very first drawing happened when I was from that led to this work. First of all, I play a lot of dominoes in the community, and I use it as a way of fellowship with people in the community. And I do that also because that's where you learn about community. You learn a lot of people doing community work. They like to do community meetings and that kind of stuff. And I'm not big on that. I mean, they're okay, but you don't get the real stuff. You get the people who like to show up at community meetings and they like to hear themselves talk, and they'll tell you everything. But then the other people that don't, they won't tell you, because they don't like, they're not going to speak in public. But if you're at the domino table with them, they talk. They just carry on. So I learned that as a strategy of community listening, and but I'm not a very focused and patient person, and I never played games and that kind of stuff, so I'm not very good at that kind of stuff. But I could fake it,
Right.
and but one of the things I caught myself doing though was watching the games play out on the table and seeing how the chips would line up, and I would take photographs of them with my camera. I'll just take little photographs of them. And I had like loads of these things, photographs. So one day, one of my mentors was sitting there, this guy, Jesse Lott. Jesse was great because he was a real community artist, and he believed that everybody should be able to tap into their creativity and make things that could help them spiritually, but also economically. So he would teach young mothers at project row houses. He'd teach people that come in from it. He'd teach them how to make objects like he makes. But the other side is he tried to get them shows And so one day we were playing, and this guy came in that wanted Jesse to do a show with him. And Jesse said, I'll do the show with you if you allow me to put some of my community people in the show. And the guy said, okay, well, how about this? I'll let you put some of your community people in if you get Rick to be in the show. And I'm like, no, 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 nope. I'm not making objects. I stopped doing that some time ago. And Jesse looked at me and he says, man, you're for the community. This is it. This is what community is about. You got to do some stuff that you don't really want to do because, then you're going to give them a chance. So kind of as a joke, I picked up, there was a stack of old posters by Mel Chin from the 80s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of from the early 80s. Jesse had them. He brought them over and they were sitting there. And
He was also a MacArthur Fellow, if I remember right.
Yeah. Mel is. Yep. And so he's also from Houston. He's from Fifth Ward. I work in Third Ward. But anyway, so I took one of these posters and I turned it face down. So it was white on the backside. And we played a game. Instead of photographing it, I traced it with a ballpoint pen. And then we played another one and I traced it. Maybe I did like 3. And then as a joke, I slid it over to Jesse and I said, okay, there's your piece. And Jesse kind of looked at it. He turned it around a few times and he goes, okay, sign it. I was like, really? So I signed it and I sent it off. But then I thought, oh, well, that was kind of an interesting exercise, And so then I start tracing these things. And then I start realizing the patterns of overlaying these things start to create a certain kind of architectural language or landscape language. And that's what kind of got me going, and then as I was doing more of that, and then I started reflecting back on the days of Project Row Houses when we were in the midst of our understanding of the consequences of developing community. It attracts new development. So gentrification possibilities were coming. So that's when I gained a deep appreciation for land development maps and, infrastructure maps and all. And we used to have them all over our community space at Project Row Houses almost from floor to ceiling. Of all these maps, kind of mapping the different kinds of things that were happening around. And I liked them. I was interested in them, interested in the color that's used on maps and all that stuff. And then I just kept, sticking with this outline of what domino games look like and cutting them and collaging them. And then it just kind of evolved into this thing. And so within that, I use these paintings as ways for me to kind of as basically reflections of the kinds of things that I know that happens within communities and how things grow and that kind of stuff. But also what I'm most interested though is like what they say to me about all the things I don't know. I mean, because there's so much that we don't know.
Right.
And, and that's just, and I say there's so many things that we don't know because, if we knew, then we wouldn't have these housing crises that we have now. I mean, even the people that are supposed to be the high level, experts, having the housing bubble happen, at the hands of, because some people will say, okay, well, you low-level nonprofit community folks, you don't have the knowledge that you do. But then you turn around and you see like even the people that are supposedly the high-level experts, they don't know, so it's
So let me ask you, has being in Houston kept you insulated from the rest of the art world, or do you find that artists have made pilgrimages to Project Row Houses? I mean, I just think of somebody like Mark Bradford as would be like a kindred spirit to you, both visually, like you're using these rectangles that look like dominoes, and you're collaging. And some of his first ones, he was using the wrapping papers from his mom's salon, and the work he does with his nonprofit Art and Practice. I mean, do you have these relationships? It's I imagine it's different than if you had wound up in New York or in LA. How has that been, getting to create and maintain relationships with other artists out there?
Yeah. Well, I've always followed the my motto has always been to, do work that excites me the most, that is most meaningful to me, wherever that might be. And and I just find that if it is really interesting and exciting, people will connect with you over it. Somehow they'll find you. It doesn't matter where you are. People, and and especially nowadays, with the internet, but even prior to that, though, people, there were ways that people got to know about things that people were doing, and you'd find your way to them. And it almost kind of made it even more special, when you find your way to, I remember, finding my way to Charleston, South Carolina for Mary Jane Jacobs' curated exhibition, Places with a Past, and where, there were people, David Hammonds and Anne Hamilton and Carrie Mae Weems, all these folks were like, that was a very, incredible project that wasn't in New York, but it pulled people from New York there, because it was interesting. And so it pulled me from Houston there because it was interesting. And I think similarly, I was, and I would say, I was very fortunate, very, very fortunate that, Project Row Houses, allowed me that privilege to be in the place that I really was doing the work that I was most connected to, that was most meaningful to me, without having to, to leave it and go somewhere else.
So let's talk about Venice. So are these pieces inspired by the Museo de Palazzo Grimani? Tell me about this body of work that you've created.
Yeah. Well, this is, showing in Europe for me is always, an opportunity to kind of, try to place the work with some relevance within that context. I mean, in the US, the context is pretty much the same, and I just kind of do it. But when I'm there, I just feel like it's something. It gives me an opportunity. Once again, there's just so much I don't know about Europe, and so much stuff there that I like to find opportunities to reflect. And so when I went to visit Palazzo Grimani, I was, one of the things that kind of weighed on me a little bit, and it just kind of stuck with me, was these shapes that you'd see, in the space. And then it just kind of resonated that, oh, well, this is in the entire city and throughout Europe, but these arches and ovals and, and these circles and all these kinds of, shapes and images that, and I was thinking that I wonder, I just had a feeling about that. And I thought, I wonder, what is that? I don't have that in my life. In Houston, we're,
right.
Yeah,
well, there's the Astrodome.
Yeah. we have the Astrodome, and maybe I should use this as an argument for the saving the Astrodome, because it's about to disappear. But
right.
But yeah, the eighth wonder of the world is about
right.
become nothing. But anyway, but it just kind of stuck with me, and I was like, I wonder. So one of the things for me is like, okay, there's this kind of this material that I use, these kind of little rectangular domino chips, and then this hieroglyphic-y kind of thing. I'm like, how will the arch respond to that? And how do I do that in a way that doesn't take me back to my the earlier painter of myself where I get very literal and trying to,
Right.
and so I just wanted to kind of, play around with that. And as I started to play around with just, the shape of the arch, just the top of the arch, then I, as I was, as I'm working, and I work long hours, I'm one of those people that just, I'll work until I'm kind of delirious and I start kind of, whatever, get sentimental and,
Right.
and all that kind of nostalgic about things and stuff. And I start thinking about time, it's like, oh my, time,
Yeah.
thinking, oh, but the arch is also like within the arch. I mean, the arch is within the arc, of time too. There's life that that this a part of this arch is actually drawing us to, and so I started to kind of think about that, and say, well, let me play around with that as a part of it. And then of course in the circle, I went deeper into the circle, to start thinking about, the whereas the arch is much more about the architecture, but
Mhm.
the arc is much more, it's metaphysical, and it has, there are all kind of other implications, psychological and spiritual implications around, the arc and the circle and all that stuff. And so I just wanted to, I just wanted to dedicate most of the work in that exhibition around that, and then there's
Sure.
other pieces that are that deaden, that just kind of look more at kind of topographical uh, mapping kinds of look.
Sure.
But yeah, so it's a
Well, you talk about arc and time, and it makes me think of archaeology. And when you start thinking about archaeology, it's almost like you're tracing and layering multiple games of dominoes, or because a city map changes and it evolves. And it was funny. I was earlier today. I was playing around with doing collage, and I was going through this National Geographic, and just kind of tossing through, and I came across a page that was a map of Manhattan that had been color coded by block based on its energy consumption. And when I flipped to that page, I was like, oh, this looks like Rick Lowe's paintings.
huh.
Because there's a spot, there are places where all of these blocks in Manhattan are the shapes of dominoes, and then the oldest communities, the Dutch, the old Lower East Side, it's it's just a mishmash of little blocks that look nothing like a rectangle, right? So I find it interesting that the arc and the arch and archaeology, they all sort of touch in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then of course, when you add that element of how I use, the domino patterns of layering, and that is,
Right.
I mean, and what's one of the things that is, some of the painting is more present in some than others, but you can kind of see how some of them actually will build the paintings up and they'll work up. And then I aggressively destroy them, you know,
Hmm.
and then build them back up, again, right? And that is, to me, it's, I'm just trying to keep the energy of my identity of what's happening in the world of communities
Right.
in my mind, bringing it into the paintings of how, there are communities that just get destroyed
Right.
for whatever reason, from neglect or, war or whatever. And then we go back and we piece them together. And then,
Okay.
and so, some will have, as I said earlier, how when I learned being a painter, I didn't unlearn that. So I took all of that experience. I continued to see things as a painter. Well, similarly, when I spent all these years doing community development and stuff, I don't unsee that either, right? So when I'm making these paintings, sometimes I think of it as, the canvas is real estate. It's
Right.
real estate, and I invest in it, and I put stuff in it, and it gets destroyed or it gets, dilapidated for whatever reason. Then I come back and I can use the term gentrify. I gentrify areas of it, whatever. And then there's questions about, how much do I want to gentrify this? Oh, it's getting too cute. It's like whatever.
Right.
You got to take, and it becomes a
And then the property value of your painting goes up, right?
Yeah, it's a conversation I have though that it's in me, this notion of when I'm in my studio, I'm in here painting, but also I still live in the world in which I think about, community, and I, still, do that work as well. So yeah, it's all a part.
Sure. Well, the biennial in Venice is this year, and so hopefully a lot of folks are able to see that work. I was able to see images from it, and I just I love where you've taken your practice, Rick, and I really appreciate how gracious you've been with your time today. And I really appreciate having you on the podcast.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate being here, and it's one of my, this is also a part of my practice too, is trying to catch myself up on, how to merge these worlds in terms of how I talk about them too, because it's still, they are one and the same within me, but the output is very different, right? They're the things that's output as community, and there are things that are output as paintings, and and I have to help people understand how they are related, and yeah. So this is great for me to just kind of have the opportunity to talk about
it. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.